I'm Lilli Hornig, and it's spelled Lilli-Hornig.
Terrific. Now we have to start. The next question is, can you give us your birthday?
I can. It's March 22nd, 1921.
Great. Okay. Now maybe you can just talk a little bit about where you were born and how you came to be one of the few women scientists at Los Alamos.
Well, that's a long story.
Okay. We'd love to hear it. We have all day.
I was born in what is now the Czech Republic, a little town probably about 50 miles north and slightly east of Prague. And I lived there until I was 8. My father was a scientist. He was a chemist working in a big dye-stuffs plant there. Dye-stuffs were still big business in the 20s. And we left there in 1929. I was 8 years old and moved to Berlin. And we lived there for 4 years. And when after Hitler came to power, my father was actually being threatened with being taken off to a concentration camp. And he spent several weeks sleeping at friends' houses so he wouldn't be found. And he left for America. And my mother and I had to wait for visas for quite a long time, several months. So we came in on election day in 1933. And LaGuardia had just been elected mayor that day. There was this huge celebration in Times Square. 1 million people all yelling and screaming. And so we went to see that. I remember that very well. My mother was actually an MD, although she didn't practice. And so I was sort of introduced to science early on. My father took me occasionally, very occasionally, on a Sunday to his lab. And I just loved all the glassware. And he gave me some micro-sized glassware for my dollhouse. So I always assumed they assumed too, I think, that I would be either a chemist or a physician. And I was kind of squeamish at the time, so I went for chemistry. And I was, pretty determined on that. We ended up living in Montclair, New Jersey. I went to high school there, junior high and high school. I was talking to a friend yesterday and remembering my first day of school when I spoke very little English. And I'd had to take placement tests, and I'd never seen a test like that before, where you check things or circle things or whatever. And the first class I actually went to was cooking, which I basically wasn't even allowed in the kitchen. And I remember what they were doing that day was making creamed carrots. And I'd never heard of a creamed vegetable. Nobody in Europe ever creams carrots. And I remember coming home, telling my mother about it. She was equally astonished. And I never cooked creamed anything since then. But Montclair was not then what it is now. I've met someone recently who lives there, and I hear it's very sort of loose and full of artists and writers and that sort of thing. That was not true at the time. It was a business place. The fathers largely commuted to New York. And I didn't find it particularly a great place to be growing up. So I was delighted to go to college, went to Bryn Mawr, and had a marvelous, marvelous time and a marvelous education, I think. And when it came to graduate school, there wasn't much question. I wanted to go to Harvard. Little did I know how women were treated at Harvard, I might say. But I found out very soon.
Can you tell us about that a little bit?
I'm not sure you want to hear all of it.
Sure.
Well, one of the first things I learned was there wasn't a ladies' room in the building. I had to go to another building to find a ladies' room, and I had to get a key for it, which was very unusual back then. And that sort of gave me a message. And then I had to meet with the department, and it was called the division room for some reason. It was the usual thing was portraits on the wall of all the past chairmen and other notables, and a long polished table. They were all sitting around one end, and I was alone at the far end, and very much under scrutiny. And the first thing they said was, well, the girls always have trouble with physical chemistry, so you'll take Harvard undergraduate physical chemistry. And I said, I'm a grad student. I didn't come here to take undergraduate courses. And they were quite upset by that idea. And I proposed that if I could pass the qualifying exam, which I didn't know ahead of time we had to take, they would let me take a graduate course. So I studied Don's notes. I met him the first day I was there, and aced the exam. But unfortunately, I really didn't know enough math. And so I had to take a graduate thermodynamics and statistical mechanics course. And I absolutely blew the thermodynamics. I didn't know what the notation meant. And I was trying to catch up. I, of course, fell behind. So I flunked the first semester, and then I got an A the second semester. But they made me retake the first semester. So, and that was all the time I actually spent at Harvard, that plus the war work. Because when we came back, Don had this appointment here, and at Brown, and the department was very nice and offered me lab space so I could do my experimental work here.
Be careful of the mic on your.
Oh.
On your.
I was just gonna say that.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah, that would be good. So why don't you start with after the war you went to Brown, or he had an appointment at Brown.
Right, and the department very kindly offered me space for to do my experimental work, and then I commuted to Harvard once or twice a week for seminars and such. And that worked out very well. I also had our first daughter that year. And just after she was born, a few months after, she was born the end of May, the chairman of the chemistry department dropped dead at his desk in his office. And it was very hard to hire faculty then because there were so many guys coming back, making huge classes, and there hadn't been any men graduating or getting their graduate degrees during the war. They'd all been doing other stuff. So they were desperate, and they asked me if I would teach his courses. He was an organic chemist, I was an organic chemist. So here I was with a brand new baby with a master's degree teaching 250 guys. And I think there were 6 girls in the first class. The Pembroke students used to come they had separate classes in a lot of the humanities, because that's where most of them were majoring, and the others were sent to the Brown campus for their coursework. It was sort of an awkward arrangement, and one of them actually was a very good student. The others I don't remember much about. But then I also had to teach a senior course, and that was much more fun. They were, it was a small group. And, I actually saw a couple of them at one of the reunions some 30 years ago now, I think. But those were good years. And then I finished we came back from Los Alamos in '46, and I finished my degree in 1950 and had my second daughter later that year. And then I had Chris after that. And then we moved to Princeton, and I had Leslie there. And we did a lot of moving.
Well, let's, why don't we back up to how you met Don? How you met Don. Go back up in time.
Okay. I had a friend from Bryn Mawr who was a year ahead of me, and she was at Harvard, also in chemistry, and she had met Don, and the day I arrived, she planned a dinner party. She had gotten married that summer. We had planned to room together, and we did later after her husband went off to the Pacific. And he was a classmate of Dawn's as well. So she had a dinner party, and that's how we met.
Nice.
And he walked me home, and the rest is history, as they say.
That's great. So how did Don, was it Don who first got an offer to, or I guess both of you were assigned to Woods Hole, is that right?
Well, I wasn't. I was planning to do my lab work down there and continue in graduate school, the same sort of arrangement that I later had with Brown. But I was still clearing up this eye business, and Don had been there all winter. We commuted back and forth, which was also unusual at the time. So we moved down there, and nobody ever asked the woman alone. Later, after we were out there, I think there was one older woman who had worked with somebody there and was hired on, but all the other women I can think of were wives who had come there because their husbands had gone. So, Don, well, that story has been told many times, and I wasn't there, but, I was home. But Bright Wilson, who had been his PhD supervisor, very good friend, was also his boss there. And the story is that he was a very sort of careful person and very sensitive about classified matters. All what they were doing was all classified. They were developing ways to measure air explosions in air. It was actually called underwater, but that was a different group. They weren't working underwater. And so Don, his thesis had ended up being on blast measurement. And he went down there, and they worked out on Nonamesset Island, and went out there, no matter what the weather, sometimes it was very rough, and set off blasts and tried to measure how well they were doing. And I was just getting settled. We were able to rent a house really. It was a carriage house on one of the big estates, and it had, I don't know, 3 or 4 garages on one end, and lots of storage space upstairs, and had this little caretaker's apartment where we lived. It had been flooded in the '38 hurricane and still had all the high water marks all over the walls. And an incredible furnace that produced masses of carbon monoxide. If you opened the door carelessly, it would all burst out and flare up. And I knew next to nothing about housekeeping. But I learned slowly. Anyway, Dwight Wilson asked Don one day said he would like him to come up to the attic, I think, in the lab. He needed to talk to him. Don had no idea what that might be about. And when they got there, Dwight said, how would you like another job? And Don's response was, what have I done wrong? He said nothing, but how'd you like another job? Don said, well, I can't, unless you tell me something about it, I can't make a decision. And Dwight said, well, I can't tell you much about it. He was a very slow speaker and very low voice. And Don said, well, tell me where it is? He said, no, I can't tell you. Well, can you at least tell me? Is it north, south, west? No, couldn't tell you. And so on. A certain amount of detail. And when it was all over, Bright said, well, I want you to think it over very carefully and go talk to Lilli and let me know your decision in the morning. So Don came home with this story. We agreed that this was not sufficient information to make a decision on. And so Don went back and said, no, he didn't think he would do it. The next thing that happened was the PA system comes on and says, Dr. Hornig, Dr. Kistiakowsky is calling you from Santa Fe. And, I guess in between, Conant had called him, James Bryant Conant. And Don was very angry about that because he actually said, haven't you seen those posters on the mailboxes that say, Uncle Sam is pointing his finger at you? And Don said, well, I don't know anything about this. Conant didn't tell him much either, but then when Kisti called, he, with a few curses, which was very much his style, he said, damn it, you come out here. And so Don brought that news home. Well, that sounded pretty interesting to me. It did to him too, obviously. But I had one reservation. I said, what am I going to do there? And so Don talked to George some more and asked him that. And George said, we're scouring the country for anybody with a master's in chemistry, especially from Harvard, is going to be more than welcome. So I was looking forward to that. But of course, no commitment of any kind. And so we bundled up our small household and drove. We had to trade in our half of a lovely sailboat in order to buy a car, which we'd never owned before. And we had an old 37 Ford Coupe that proved to be very useful later because somebody had knocked out the board between the trunk and the seat. So there was a clear 6-foot space back there. And it became an ambulance for the ski slope. I took 2 people, including Klaus Fuchs, to the hospital when they had skiing accidents. But anyway, back to getting out there. Don, of course, went straight to work. And I went to the personnel office. And the first question was, how fast can you type? And I said, I don't type. And I actually didn't, not in the usual sense. I've learned a lot since. So anyway, that presented a problem to them, but they scouted around, and then I had to fill out a security questionnaire and quintuplicate. And they looked at it. I had, at the time, had relatives in Ireland, Argentina, Spain, maybe Switzerland, I don't remember. They all moved around so much I had no idea anymore. So they looked at this and said, oh, this can take weeks to come back. But it turned out that they had already investigated my father quite thoroughly. And so BSQ came back in 3 days, and I had a job in the chemistry department doing what was called fundamental wet research, which was involved working with plutonium, determining the solubility of various plutonium salts. There was essentially nothing known about plutonium chemistry at the time. And there was one other woman in the division. She and I worked together, and we had our little cubby hole and did our little procedures and put them under the Geiger counter. And it wasn't terribly inspiring, and nobody actually really spoke to us. Our boss was Don Wall, who came from Berkeley, and they were pretty much a closed society anyway. So we plugged along there for a couple of months, and then they got the first results from Hanford with the bad news about 240, plutonium 240, which was much more active than 239. And the first response was to fire both of us instantly. And I complained a bit about that, and they worried, obviously, about reproductive damage. And I tried delicately to point out that they might be more susceptible than I was. That didn't go over well. But I guess I wasn't very good at handling things like that. So I went back to the personnel office, and they said, well, they need people in X division, which was Kisty's division. So I went to see him, and he was by then a good friend, but this was strictly business. And he gave me several choices, which I explored, and then I ended up with Henry Lynchitz and Walter Kautzman, measuring shock fronts from potential implosions, trying to get a perfect segment of a sphere on the shock front, which we never quite managed. And it was very interesting, actually, because in the end, all we had was empirical stuff. There was no theory yet that explained what was happening in the shock front. And basically, Kisty took a huge gamble at the same time as he was taking a gamble on Don's firing unit. So that's what I did then for most of the rest. I quit after the test and was planning to go back to graduate school early and get my hands into it really, while Don would still finish out there. But as it turned out, I came down with hepatitis. During the war, a lot of people had hepatitis from food. I ate one raw oyster in my entire life. That was it. And I was very, very sick for weeks and weeks. So I didn't go back to school, but I did go back to work eventually. At the time, in the early summer, late spring of '46, they were starting to move stuff to Sandia, and everything that our group had done was going down there, that Don's group had done. I suppose my previous one had already been dissolved. And so...
Maybe we can, that was terrific, unless you want to, did you have a thought you want to add?
Well, I did have a thought, but it'll come back.
Go ahead.
No, I actually don't know what, well, I was going to mention what Don was doing, which was probably is better known, surely. And now, he was very discouraged the first few months we were there because there really wasn't anything for him to do. There were no blasts to measure, except stuff that he already knew how to do. And so he was pretty discouraged about that and bored. But we all went to, all the people with white badges could go to any meeting they wanted to. And he went to one on initiating the blast. I think there were only a few people there. And they were working on synchronizing a bunch of 32 detonators with primacord, which you know about, I assume. Primacord looks like a piece of rope, and it's an explosive, and you can time the moment of the explosion by how much primacord you use, how far the distance is. And you connect it to a detonator and set it off with a little charge. So that was what they were working on, hoping to synchronize all this. I do not remember all the technical details, but I think the 32 points had to detonate within something like a millionth of a second. And there was no hope at that point that you could do that with primacord and detonators. And so Don went to think about this, and he thought that a triggered spark gap, and don't ask me to explain it, was the way to go. And he took that idea to Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer said, let's see you work on it. So that's what he worked on. He designed these spark gaps that were, forgotten how they were charged up with condensers, I guess. I'm sure you probably know more details about it than I do. You've read Lillian Hodison's book? Yeah, I assumed that. I think she describes it very well. So that's what Don ended up doing. And that's how he came to be on the tower babysitting the bomb at Trinity. And Ben Peterson was one of the SEDs in the group. Whereas I dealt with David Greenglass. He was a tech sergeant in the shop, machine shop, and I used to take our designs to him to be made up, the plates we used for the explosions. And Klaus Fuchs used to come to we had a weekly section meeting where we reported, little bits of information. And Klaus Fuchs came to every one of those. And I always wondered why he was a very silent man. And, I don't recall him ever asking a question, but he took notes all along. And so between him and Greenglass, I probably contributed some information. Unwittingly.
Would you have thought either one was a spy? Would you have thought either one was a spy?
Not Greenglass, no. He was just a Brooklyn kid. He was a lot like Ben Peterson. You know, irreverent and fresh. But Klaus Fuchs, I was very suspicious of. I didn't think of it as spying. I mean, I was uneasy. He made a lot of people uneasy, I think. He was so sort of closed in himself. And I remember he asked me to dance. So there was the British mission gave a huge party after the end of the war. And, or maybe it was before then. But anyway, we danced, and I knew he was coming from Germany, and having come from there myself, I sort of thought we might have something in common. But he was very silent about his own background. Very vague about, well, some of his family were there and some weren't. The whole thing sounded odd to me, and I think I remember talking to Don about it afterward, saying, I think I really sort of creepy, I think. But I certainly didn't follow up in any way.
I understand a lot of people used him as a babysitter, including the tellers.
I've heard that. Well, the tellers, they were nuts anyway. I shouldn't say that. He was, they were both very vigorous people. And he was kind of a loudmouth. I think he had few friends here. But there was this whole Hungarian mafia, Wigner at Princeton, who was also came to Los Alamos some, and Teller, and who was the other one?
Van Neumann?
Oh.
Johnny Van Neumann?
Yeah. Him and
Can you say the name?
Pardon?
They're probably not gonna hear my questions. So if you say yes, Johnny Van Neumann was another or something like that.
Yes, John Van Neumann was one of that group, and Leo Szilard. So they, but I remember John very well. He spent quite a bit of time at Los Alamos, and then we used to see him in Princeton as well. I never met Szilard, but Teller was the sort of loudmouth in the group. Wigner was a very quiet guy.
What about, do you have any recollection of Teller playing the piano?
I do. We went to dinner there, and he played for us, actually. Don is very musical, I'm not, so he enjoyed that very much, but I remember him doing that.
Can you say, I remember Edward Teller playing, and then can you tell anything about what he liked to play? What kind of music?
Well, I'm sure it was, I do remember Edward Teller playing the piano. I can't begin to remember what he played. I'm sure it was classical. He may have also played other stuff, but what I heard was classical, sonata probably.
I always think of him playing the Hungarian Rhapsody. I don't know, I'm just belting it out, but that's sort of
Well, he played with vigor. He does everything else.
I'm going to back up for a second. Can you tell us about when you first arrived at Santa Fe? I assume you arrived at Santa Fe and went to 109 East Palace.
Oh, I can. I remember it very well.
So make sure you refer to say, I remember 109 East Palace and Dorothy McKibben. Use those words and names because they won't hear the question.
Sure. Okay. Yes, I remember very well arriving in Santa Fe because we had a miserable trip. We drove through a thunderstorm coming up 285, I think it was, from Tucumcari to Santa Fe, and the road just went over the hills. There were no road cuts. It went up and down a lot, and it was a huge thunderstorm that we could watch it sort of stitching across the hilltops, and then it hit our car. It was a terrific jolt and a blue-white flash, but it was raining so hard that being on rubber tires, we would otherwise possibly not have survived that, but it just got grounded through the rain. So that was all right, but we were a little bit shaken, and we arrived late in the afternoon in Santa Fe. Went to 109 East Palace, where the local office was, and they were already closed. So we went to La Fonda and settled in there for the night. And it was just an enchanting place. I mean, it was nothing like it is now. It was, lots of interesting stuff everywhere. I'd never been in the Southwest. I've been in Colorado, but not this kind of thing at all. And we were both just enchanted. And the next morning, we checked out of the hotel and went to have breakfast in a coffee shop down on the plaza. And there were a couple, and I looked at them. Said, he looks like a physicist to me. And it turned out to have been Bob and Bruce Marchak, excuse me. But we didn't find that out till later. The reason they come into the story is we left breakfast and went to 109 East Palace and met Dorothy McKibben. I think she was the only person there. And she was just a wonderful person. Everybody adored her. She was sort of mommy to everybody. And invited people to her house for dinners and various things. And so she told us where we were going. That sounded like great fun. So off we went. I think we stuck to the main road and went up through Espanola. But the road up the hill was under construction at the time, but people were still using the old dirt road. It's one car wide. And in fact, we found out later, the week before we got there, a truck had gone over the side. The driver was killed, of course. And it was a hazardous drive, but so exciting. And Dorothy had said when you get there, she'd given us passes, of course, and go through the gate and go into the center of town and head for the water tower because that's where the housing office is. So we did that. Didn't know it was going to be as easy as it turned out to be to find the water tower. And I had in mind town, which it certainly wasn't at the time. And what was her name? Vera, somebody who ran it. I might think of her last name, but I can't right now. Assigned us to T54, which was a little house right next to the PX. And 2 apartments, one on each end, single story. That awful greeny color. But in front was a lovely pond, the fire pond, and a grassy meadow going down to it, and I thought that was a nice place to live. Well, it turned out later that that place had actually been assigned to the Marshaks, but they hadn't showed up yet because they were sightseeing. Ruth insisted she had to see Santa Fe. So we lucked out, and they didn't, because they ended up in one of the, I think it was McKee housing, the little prefab sorts of places, and it was terrible. I don't think she ever forgave us because they had been sent the floor plan. And so, they were established compared to us. And so they had chosen the furniture to bring and had it shipped, and it, of course, didn't fit where they were. I don't know what they did about it, but that was sort of a funny sidelight on the whole thing. And although the place we were assigned was filthy, so first thing it needed was a good scrub. And they gave us 2 GI bunks and a table and 2 chairs, and that was it. Our furniture supposedly was coming by freight and should have been there a week or 2 later. We didn't yet have it 2 months later, so we called up the mover in Falmouth, and he said, "Oh, I'm so glad you called." Said, I jotted down your address on an envelope somewhere and I can't find it. So he hadn't shipped anything yet. He finally did, and it arrived in August. We got there in the middle of May. But the next morning, there was all kinds of machinery out front. They were putting up a 10-foot chain link fence and paving over the meadow for a parking lot for the GI vehicles. So that was our view for the rest of our time at Los Alamos. But other than that, it was lovely. We looked right across the valley at the mountains. And it was a beautiful place.
What did you do for recreation?
We did a lot of camping and hiking. We were both hikers, and my good day is 35 miles a day with a full pack. How's that?
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, you wouldn't believe it now, would you?
Tell us about the ski hill.
The
ski hill.
Oh, Sawyer's Hill was the ski hill, and we did ski there. I sort of learned to ski. I never really liked it. When I turned 50, I said, "That's it, no more skiing." And we rode, often with Kisti and his soon-to-be wife, Irma Schuler. And we had one interesting ride with the 2 of them. We had several, but this particular one, we were going to a ranch on the other side of the Rio Grande. So we went down. We used horses from the cavalry stables. They rented them out. They liked to have them exercised. And the reason they had cavalry was to guard the fences. And so we went over to this ranch. It was kind of a long ride, too. It was 30 or 40 miles. And we got there, and it turned out the woman who owned it and ran it as a guest ranch was Russian, apparently had been a duchess, but I wouldn't swear to that. And the other, there was one woman staying there who said she was Swiss, but she had a very strong German accent, and she was traveling with a male guide. She was planning to film bears in the mountains, she said. That seemed a funny thing to be doing in the middle of the war, actually. And for dinner, the Russian Duchess had a friend there, staying with her, a woman friend. And for dinner, they'd invited a guy who was a rancher in the valley somewhere. And I will never forget him because he came on a white horse with a black cloak floating behind him. And he had bright white hair and a very handsome guy, I might say, and a huge silver belt. just the character. As the evening went on, we realized that Don and Irma were the only two native-born Americans in this whole crowd. And I was quite sure the so-called Swiss lady was a spy. She may well have been, I don't know. I don't remember now who this spectacular male was, but he made quite a picture galloping across the desert.
Well, one person I'd love to hear more about, if you could talk about George Kistiakowsky.
Well, he was just a great guy.
Can you repeat that to say George Kistiakowsky?
Well, George Kistiakowsky was a character, and we thought a great person. There were people who hated his guts, I think, and Taylor may have been one of them. I'm not sure about that. But he was a fine scientist and had a great deal of experience that was suitable for the project. He had been an officer in the White Russian Army in the First War as a kid of 18, I think, and fought his way out to Odessa, I believe. And I think they commandeered a ship somehow. In between, he's written this up. There's an article, I think it was in the New York Times Magazine, where he recalled some of that era. But the story went that he was interned by the French in Odessa. I can't vouch for this. And that they were so dirty that he escaped and went to an English internment camp. But anyway, eventually he and his crew apparently commandeered this ship. None of them had ever been to sea before, but they figured out how to run it. Then they discovered that they were actually in the middle of a minefield in the harbor, or as they came out of the harbor, but they made their way, and he ended up at that point in Berlin. And made a living as a glassblower. He was a fabulous glassblower, which is not an easy skill to learn. And he could blow quartz spirals, and that was a fairly esoteric kind of thing. Almost nobody ever was able to do that. So he made a living that way, and at the same time or shortly after began his graduate work with Nernst, I believe, at the university in Berlin. And I assume that's when he married his first wife. I've never met her. And they eventually came here. I don't know about the timing exactly. I think it was in the late 20s. And he went to Princeton for a bit, I believe, before coming to Harvard, where he spent except for Los Alamos and being science advisor to Eisenhower, he spent the rest of his career at Harvard. I see his wife every Tuesday. We go to lunch together in Cambridge.
So what was he like? Why was he recruited to go to Los Alamos?
Well, he had been a place called, during the war, he went to a place called Brewston, which was an explosives research place in or near Pittsburgh. I don't know exactly. And so he was a leading expert on explosions. And that's why he was at Los Alamos. And he was, I think, probably as frustrated as Don a good part of the time with, sort of having to wait so long before they could actually do what they were asked to do, which is measure explosion. But he was a very gregarious sort. He was either friends or enemies with lots of people. And a great charmer, as you undoubtedly have heard. Very good friend.
So he was working on the implosion lenses as well. Is that something that Don got involved in or not?
The lenses, no, that was what I did. Yeah, he had, the whole bomb assembly was in that division.
So tell us, what do you recall about the Oppenheimers?
Not much. He,
Make sure you use Oppenheimer's.
Oppenheimer was universally admired. I think his wife, Kitty, probably wasn't. She was a difficult person, is my impression. I barely knew her and really didn't know him well at all. I had no occasion to be close with them. And we were half their age. We were 23 and 24 when we got there. And he was in his 40s, so there were more people our age than his. Very youthful crowd. I remember General Groves getting very annoyed at the fact that there were so many women having babies in the hospital there. Apparently, most of the cases were maternity cases. And he didn't think the U.S. Army should be paying for all that, but they did.
Let's see. Oh, maybe you could tell us about your experience during the Trinity test. Remember you went to Sandia Mountain? And
I did, yeah. During the Trinity test, I knew it was coming up. In fact, 2 days before, they'd had a malfunction down there, an early misfire on the X unit, and at 2 o'clock in the morning, our group leader, Lou Fussell, was knocking on my bedroom window saying, "You have to get up, we have some work to do." And he and I went off to the tech area at 2 o'clock in the morning with a list of equipment that we had to replace down there. And neither of us had ever been in the stockroom before, mind you. So we had quite a time finding it. But by about 5 o'clock, I think we had everything together, and it got shipped off on a truck, and they had it in the morning down there. But anyway, I had planned to drive up to Sandia Mountain, which had a nice road to the top, and a clear view, 110 or so miles down to the Trinity site. And some friends came with me, Earl and Betty Thomas. No, I guess Earl was, it was just Betty Thomas. I think Earl may have been at Trinity. David Anderson, who was also part of the X group. I'm not quite sure. He was a physicist, and I'm not quite sure what his job was. But he was a friend that we hiked with and did other things with. And so the three of us, a car couldn't have taken more than three. We're up there, and we knew it was, the shot was scheduled to go off before sunrise in order to, for all the cameras to function properly. And so there we sat at 10,000 feet, and we slept a little. We put sleeping bags on the ground. None of us slept very well. And so we got up about 3 o'clock, I guess, and started waiting for the shot, kept keeping our eyes glued on the site. And we waited, and at 4:30 the sun rose. And we were so crushed, disappointed, and said, well, I guess it's not going to go today, and we had to go back up through the hill and get to work. And so we packed up our sleeping bags and got in the car. It didn't take long. I mean, it was a quick decision. And I was sitting in the car reaching for my ignition key, and the thing loomed in front of us. And of course, we had neglected the fact that at 10,000 feet, the sun rises earlier than it does at 2,000 or 3,000 down in the desert. So we blamed ourselves for not being good scientists there. But we did see it, and it was just incredible. Just a couple of nights ago, I saw a film on PBS of the super bomb tests. And it reminded me very strongly, of course, the scale is far bigger. But the pictures are much like that. What I remember in my mind is these sort of boiling clouds and color, vivid colors like violet, purple, orange, yellow, red, just everything. It was fantastic. And we were all kind of shaken up, but and we waited for the shock wave to come, which it did, the requisite, 15 minutes later. And then we backed up and started down the mountain. And we stopped at a diner somewhere near Albuquerque for breakfast. And the guy behind the counter said, "You guys know anything about that explosion they had down at the proving grounds?" I said, "What? No, we didn't know about that." Yes, I remember the petition not to use the bomb as a weapon came around just after the test. And I don't know, I think it may have originated in Chicago or maybe in Oak Ridge, but I think Chicago is right. Some of my friends in the same group, whatever it was, X something, were signing it, and I thought about it. I thought that was a good idea. I think many of us had really worked on the bomb, with the thought that it might deter Hitler. And once the European war was over with, well, a lot of the people left right away. Kisti left, for instance, soon after that. There wasn't, certainly among the scientists, the same gut feeling about using it. And we thought in our innocence that, of course it made no difference, but that if we petitioned hard enough, they might do a demonstration test, something like they later did at Bikini and Uituk, and invite the Japanese to witness it. But of course the military, I think, had made the decision well before that they were going to use it no matter what. And so we had very mixed feelings about that. I think Don was still at Trinity when I signed it. I'm not sure about that. Actually, he came back the next day after the test. He and George drove up in a Jeep with no top, and the Jeeps in those days didn't even have side straps. And they were both exhausted, of course. They took turns driving, apparently, and whenever one of them veered off the road, the other one said, "Time for you to take a nap, let me drive." And they came, Irma was at our house waiting for them. They came over. They came late in the day, it's not dinner time. And George literally fell asleep sitting in a straight chair. So Irma took him home, and Don had a good long nap. But they were quite exhilarated. Had been a success. But when the bomb was dropped, Don and I were actually in Milwaukee visiting his family because his brother was in the Navy and was slated to be shipped out, and this was his leave, for just a few days before showing up at the West Coast. And we knew damn well he wasn't going to be going anywhere much, at least not into danger. And we knew that the drop was imminent. We didn't know the precise moment. And certainly Don's parents didn't have TV at the time, and I don't know if there were ever any news on. But Don and I went downtown, and they were all the papers with the headlines, so we knew it had gone off. That was an odd mix of feelings. I mean, certainly some triumph, and the destruction was just so incredible. I think we've all been a little haunted by that over the years. But we had an interesting experience several years ago. Don was asked to come and speak at the University of Colorado in a science policy program that was working on a volume of all the science advisors they could find to talk about how science policy gets made, how the president makes those decisions. And while we were there, we sat in with various seminars, and also went to an undergraduate class in physics, and spoke briefly, stayed for the rest of it, and afterwards a student came up to us, a young man, probably about 30, and clearly half Japanese, and he said, I'm going to tell you something that's rather hard for me, because, in Japan we're very, very close in the family, and we don't talk much to other people about our feelings. But he said, my grandmother was in Hiroshima when the bomb was dropped, and she survived, and so did my mother. And when she got engaged to an American serviceman later, and was coming here, he said, my grandmother told her that she should be glad she's going, and that, I'm trying to think of the precise words, but basically that the atom bomb had been a blessing for Japan because it got rid of the old government, and the war, the other destruction that was taking place, which was actually worse than what these bombs did, except it all happened, in a flash, one moment. But I was very moved by that he told us that. He had been a Marine. He'd done a stint in the Marines, and then he decided to get an education when he came out. So I've thought back about that a number of times. It was a good experience to have after all those years.
That's great. So are there any other thoughts you have looking back? That was really well said, and that was good.
It was a fabulous time in our lives. That's really the answer. We were so young when I look now at our grandchildren, the youngest ones are about the age we were then. And they're so not yet really adult in some ways. And they don't think of themselves as having adult responsibilities. That's very striking to me, because we had no doubt that we were grown up. But, we weren't the only people. There were lots of other people who were our age with very responsible jobs.
A lot of people say, oh, we should have a Manhattan Project to solve this problem, like climate control.
Well, I haven't heard that, so this is very off the cuff. I don't think you could put together anything like a Manhattan Project now. I think we have an undereducated population. We don't ask much of kids in school or college. And college is largely a joke in many places. You've probably seen some of the recent studies where kids study 4 or 5 hours a week. That's it. They don't bother going to class. They can get it on the screen. I don't think there's the reserve of people with that kind of drive or really goal-orientedness. They wait a long time to make up their minds what they're going to do with their lives. And we didn't do that. We didn't have the opportunity. We had to make a living and get our education and do what had to be done. So it was a very different time, obviously. But, there are loads of scientific problems to be solved. But one of the worst problems is, how do you convince people who are not educated, in science certainly, who think they know everything already, and who don't, it isn't even just science, it's understanding what's a fact. And, you call it climate change theory, or theory of evolution. It's not really a theory in that sense. There are a lot of facts that support that, and, there are not enough people who actually look at those. I haven't done this much talking in years.
Yeah, you're doing great. Goodness me. Well, this has been terrific. I think we've gone over almost everything I had in my notes here. Monica, do you have any?
Sure. Do you have any regrets about going to Los Alamos? Were there any vet shortages or any sort of restrictions and wartime living?
No, we were better off than people on the outside. We still had to use points for our, meat and coffee and things like that, but they were available, which wasn't true elsewhere. And we bought cigarettes, I think, $1.10 a carton. We were big smokers back then. And
do you remember any social life? Any events at the Fuller?
Massive social life. We've never had a busier one. Everybody got together for dinners or hikes or go camping or go routing. There was a theater group Don was in, and I did scenery for them. And there was lots of music, but somehow we weren't in that much. Don is very musical. He used to play the violin, but somehow he just didn't there. What else did we do? Well, we went off to Indian pueblos for dances and that kind of thing. I remember, of course, we had Indian women who were assigned as house cleaners. And one I had came from, excuse me, San Ildefonso. And we went down one Sunday. We were up buying pottery, actually, and ran into her. She invited us into her house. And I saw a papoose board with a baby on it. It was swinging from the ceiling, and everybody who went by gave it a little shove, and that baby was happy as a clam. And then she said, "Oh, the christening is next Sunday. Will you come?" And we said, "Yes, we'd love to." So we came down there with a little present and all that sort of thing. There wasn't any christening. Nothing ever happened. That was kind of funny. But yeah, there was an awful lot of sightseeing to do. And, we did all we had time for. Some complained and some loved it. It depended a lot, I think, on how housebound they were with little kids. It was kind of hard work. It was not a clean place. There were a lot of dust storms and that sort of thing. And, you came in from a dirt road directly into your living room. So if you were a good housekeeper, which I wasn't, you probably fretted about that. Some of them, I had one friend, her husband worked in the group, and they had a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old and 2 dogs, 2 Dalmatians, and then she had twins, and the dogs had 11 puppies in a 2-bedroom apartment. It was a real zoo.